Well, hello, everyone. We're so glad that you're here today with us for today's Wednesday webinar. Our topic today is what you need to know about filing the 24-25 FAFSA. I'm Mila Tappan. I'm the Manager of College Access and Outreach at the Finance Authority of Maine, otherwise known as FAME. And with me today to answer questions and to let me know about questions are Jess Whittier and Mary Dyer. I think Nikki Vachon is also going to drop in a moment. She had an appointment. So thank you to my other teammates for being here to help with this. We do encourage you to ask your questions as we go through today. We've turned off the chat, so please put them in the Q&A. Having them in the Q&A makes it a lot easier for us to make sure we don't miss a question. And anything that we don't get answered today that we need to follow up on or we just simply don't get to, we will answer in writing. This session is being recorded. The recording of this session and any follow-up questions being answered and anything else will be sent out in the next week. Okay, so if you have anything that doesn't get answered today, we will send an email and follow up with that along with the recording and the updated slides. I did make a couple slight tweaks to the slides after I sent it out. I added in a slide or two, so you'll get the updated version. This is an hour and a half presentation. Normally our Wednesday webinars are an hour, but we find for this particular topic, it's a lot of content, so we really need a little extra time. So it is an hour and a half. But again, if you need to leave at leave at 2, just go ahead and do that. Know you'll get the recording with all of the content. All righty. So with that, let's get started. So what we're going to talk about today is first, we're going to talk about the steps that are required prior to filing the FAFSA. These are so critical. Hopefully many families and students have already done this, but not everybody has. So we're going to touch on that. Then we're going to walk through the FAFSA. We're actually going to go through the scenario where a dependent starts the FAFSA and how that works. And then we're going to do a little bit of a summary as to how it works if the parent is the one who starts the FAFSA. The FAFSA is now role-based, and so we'll go into more detail about all of that. There are also some other scenarios that we'll just provide a little bit of information on in case you have students in those situations, so you'll know what to expect. We have shared a lot of screenshots because I think that I know personally, I actually use this throughout the year when I want to go back and I want to see exactly how a question is worded or what the sequencing is. One thing I do want you to know, though, is that some of the screenshots are not as clear as I wish they could be. We are using a mix of screenshots from federal student aid, but they were released in July, so some of them have been updated. We're using those ones. We're using Jess, God love her, went ahead and did a FAFSA for Margot and took screenshots, and I did the same with my niece. So you're going to see the slides are from a variety of sources, but they are, to our knowledge, the most up-to-date version of the current slides. And the other thing I would just say today is that we're still learning. For all of us, this is brand new as well. This is a major overhaul. So I really dislike it when I have to say I don't know the answer to a question, but there's no doubt there's going to be a question today that I'm going to say that I don't know the answer to. But please ask your questions. We'll answer what we can, and what we don't know, we will follow up on. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about FSA IDs. So federal student aid accounts, what we refer to as FSA IDs, are the first step in filing the FAFSA. So that's step number 1 for everyone. And we spent a lot of the fall talking about FSA ID creations. Federal student aid accounts are set up at studentaid.gov. Everything kind of lives on the studentaid.gov site now. When an account is created, people set up a username and a password. And this is what we technically refer to as an FSA ID. So if you hear us say, or anyone else says, hey, did you get your FSA ID? What we mean is, have you gone in and created your student aid account, and do you have your username and password? The FSA ID is required to access the FAFSA, and it's also required to do anything federal student aid related. So, for example, if students going through this process ultimately end up borrowing a federal student loan, guess how they sign their master promissory note? They sign it using their FSA ID. So they are going to need this FSA ID for years to come, which is why we want people to be so careful when they're creating them. Now, when creating an FSA ID and creating their account, the individual is going to provide identifying information, including their social security number. So, because people only have one social security number, individuals can only have one FSA ID or one federal student aid account. Typically, not today, but up till this year, people without a social security number were not able to create an FSA ID. However, a process has been created so that people without a social security number can now create a federal student aid account and establish their own FSA ID. This process is very similar to those who do have an SSN, except that there's an extra step at the end to verify their identity. Because those of us who have a social security number, basically what they're doing is they're verifying we're who we say we are. People who don't have a social have a different process to verify their identity. At the end of creation of an FSA ID, they will get 4 knowledge-based questions that people who have a social security number don't see. If they're unable to answer those correctly, they'll have to provide additional documentation via email. We did do a session. We did a series of FAFSA Fridays this fall. We did them in September, October, November, and December. The November session, we focused on this particular process. So if you want to know more details about that, please check that out. Now, here's a big caveat. It's not working the way it's supposed to. Okay, so this creation process for people who don't have a social security number has some issues with it. Apparently, people are not seeing the knowledge-based questions. So people who are getting through the process all are having to provide verification information, and there's issues with that. So what do I say about that? I will say about that federal student aid knows it's an issue. They are apparently working on resolving the issue. It's a little bit tricky with any of this stuff, to be honest with you, because we don't have dummy accounts, so we can't just go test out this process. So if I go to create an FSA ID and indicate I don't have a social, the system knows I do, and it won't let me do that. We do have some events coming up where we'll be working with individuals who don't have social security numbers. So we hope to learn more about how that process is working next week. And as we learn more, we'll share more as well. So if you have families in this situation, they can attempt to create a federal student aid account, but I do think it's going to be a little bit bumpy for them. If you do decide to go ahead and have them do that right now, please share back your experience with us, because that's really, really helpful to us as well. So they created a new term this year called contributors. I don't like it because I don't think it's clear. I think it's creating confusion, but you know what? They didn't ask us. So a contributor is someone who's required to put information on the FAFSA, but specifically a contributor is someone who has to have their own FSA ID. A contributor is someone who not only has to provide information, but literally has to go into the FAFSA with their FSA ID and provide that information. The reason that a contributor has to provide their own FSA ID is because all contributors are going to be required to provide consent, new term again this year, to have their federal tax information, or FTI, transferred directly from the IRS to the Department of Education into the FAFSA, living behind the scenes, and then redisclosed to colleges and other organizations like FAME. So in order to have a student be eligible for federal student aid, everybody has to provide consent. And in order to provide consent, you have to be able to log in with your own FSA ID. Okay? I'm going to talk more about this though, so hold tight for a moment if you have questions about that. A student is always a contributor. So every single student, remember the FAFSA is a student application. It's the student that's applying for financial aid. So every single student is a contributor, and every single student needs to have their own FSA ID. Other possible contributors include a parent, if a student is considered to be dependent, potentially that parent's spouse, and we'll talk about when they are and when they aren't considered a contributor, and potentially a student's spouse. Same thing, we'll talk about when they are and when they are not considered a contributor. So one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about this fall was making sure that people identified who their parent contributors are. So in the case of students who are considered dependent and have to provide parent information on the FAFSA, we needed to understand who of those people needed to have their own FSA ID and who has to provide information on the form. So kind of think of this as a three-step process. And when we're working with students, we want them and their families to figure out which of these three scenarios they fit into. So the first scenario is when parents are married and they filed a joint 22 tax return. Keep in mind that the year of taxes that we're using for the 24-25 FAFSA is 22. So 2022 is the key year when we're talking about taxes. If parents filed a joint tax return, if parents are married and filed a joint tax return, then information for both parents is going to be on the FAFSA. That's always been the case. Both parents are going to have to be listed, but only one parent needs an FSA ID. And that's because if they filed a joint tax return, one parent can grant consent on behalf of the other. So my husband and I filed a joint tax return in 2022. So if I am in a situation where I'm filing as the parent, I have an FSA ID, my husband doesn't need one. I'm going to provide some of his demographic information, but I can provide consent on behalf of both of us because we filed a joint tax return. Okay. Second scenario is if parents are married to each other, but they filed their taxes separately for whatever reason, and I read about 15% of families do this, or the biological or adopted parents, we use those interchangeably, live together but aren't married. In that situation, again, information for both parents needs to be on the FAFSA, but additionally, both parents are going to have to log in with their own FSA ID. They're each going to need to have their own FSA ID, and they will both be required to log into the FAFSA. And that's because if they file taxes separately, or basically if they don't file a joint return, they cannot provide consent on behalf of each other. Each of them individually has to go into the FAFSA, log in with their FSA ID, and provide that consent. Now, here's scenario number 3, and I'm going to take a break after we finish up this FSA ID questions and take any the section and take any questions that you have. So the third scenario is if parents are divorced, separated, or were never married, but don't live in the same household. Then what we have to do is a two-step process on this one. First, we need to determine which parent is going to be the parent on the FAFSA. And this is a slight tweak to how it was in the past. Now the definition of who is the parent on the FAFSA is the parent who provided the most financial support in the last 12 months. That is the parent who will be the parent on the FAFSA. The other parent, believe it or not, is not required to provide any information or have anything to do with the FAFSA. So let's just say I am the student. Let's say my parents are divorced. My mom provides 60% of my support. My dad provides 40%. My mom is going to be the parent on the FAFSA. She's going to need an FSA ID. My dad will not be on the FAFSA, and so therefore he will not need an FSA ID at all. He's completely exempt from that. CSS profile is different, but for the FAFSA, he's not on it. Now that I've identified that mom is my parent on the FAFSA, the question I have to ask myself, is mom married or remarried? Is she married on the day the FAFSA gets filed? And if she is, and we know people don't like this, if she is, her spouse's information is also going to be required on the FAFSA, okay? So her spouse's demographic information is going to be required. Now, whether or not her spouse needs their own FSA ID, because they need to log into the FAFSA, you probably know where this is headed. If they filed a joint tax return in 2020, we don't need the spouse to get an FSA ID and to log in. Mom can grant consent on her partner's behalf. However, if they didn't file a joint tax return in 2022, then the spouse will need to get their own FSA ID, sign into the FAFSA, and provide consent. It works the same way with independent students who are married. So if I have an independent student who is married, their spouse's demographic information is going to be required on the FAFSA. It's going to take that spouse's information into account. But whether or not the spouse needs to sign in themselves with their own FSA ID depends on whether or not they filed joint taxes in 2022. If they did, the spouse doesn't need their own FSA ID. If they did not, then their spouse will need to sign in with their own FSA ID. Okay, so that's the scoop on that. Here is where you would go to create your FSA ID. You go to studentaid.gov, click on create account or log in if you already have one. If people choose to do it on the phone, which I'm not doing because my eyes aren't good enough, but people can, you would just click on this little icon here and that will get you to the same place that this does. All right, ladies, any questions before we move ahead and start talking about filling out the FAFSA itself?
So we have had a couple of questions about assets. I've let them know that we'll talk about that when we get there.
Absolutely, yes.
But Mel had a question. She noticed that when she filled out the FAFSA for her kiddos, that they still asked for the other parent's info, even though they're married at the end. And so I was beginning to explain that they're still going to ask for the other parent's information, but unless that parent, unless they filed separately, they're not going to need their ID to log in, which is what you just said.
Exactly. And we're going to touch on that. So I've got that scenario coming up. And keep in mind that people have always had to provide the other parent's information. And then now what they're doing as well is they're using that information to make sure that that was indeed the parent that was on the FAFSA. I mean, on the taxes, excuse me, on the taxes. Okay. So they want to, in a married joint case, they need to be sure that if one parent is granting consent on behalf of the other, that it actually is the other parent on that tax return.
The other thing that I hit with a family was because the parent being identified at the end, so it's at the end of the parent section, you're about to finish, so you identify the other parent. They were hitting a glitch because that parent had once created an ID and the information they were providing didn't match.
We've got a bigger issue there. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, we'll talk about that because I think there's a glitch in the system in general. So I'll touch on that, Jess. So if everyone, we'll get to that in just a little bit. Sound okay?
Okay, perfect.
Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through a FAFSA, filing a FAFSA as a dependent student. Now I know we have independent students out there. It's actually a much easier process for them. So instead we're going to do a dependent student because I think a lot of you are working with dependent students. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the FAFSA is now roles-based. So this is very different than what we were used to, where it was one form that the student started and then eventually you got to the parent section. Now these sections are actually divided. There's a student section on the FAFSA and there is a parent section on the FAFSA. Either person can start the FAFSA. We'll talk about some pros and cons associated with that, but either person can start the FAFSA. Whoever starts it will invite the other party to participate in the completion of that FAFSA. So if a student starts it, which is what we're going to see in a moment, they're going to invite their parent to complete the FAFSA. If the parent starts it, they're going to invite the student to complete the FAFSA. This piece is absolutely critical. This invitation process, and we're going to see slides on it in a moment, is how the two sections get connected. So this is a really, really critical piece to making this process work on the dependent side. So based on our limited experience, and it is limited, we have seen it work best if everyone's available to have the student start the FAFSA, assuming their parent will provide them with their identifying information, including their social security number. This is what Federal Student Aid wants to happen. They want the students to start the FAFSA. It's their application. They want them to invite the parent and then the parent to complete their role. So they kind of built it because that's how they want it to work. So I do think that's how it works best. That said, there are going to be times when the student isn't available. We're going to be working with parents where the student isn't at home and they're not accessible. And parents are going to, in some cases, just want to do the FAFSA as much of it as they can. And certainly they want to start it themselves. That is okay as well. And that does seem to be working. So again, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons going forward, but I think either scenario works. But because they designed it for the student to start it, that's their preference. I think that's the smoothest process. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to look at it from that perspective. So the student is the one who's starting the FAFSA, okay, in this scenario. At the end of this presentation or towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to share information on some of the other scenarios. So hold tight, there will be more information on all of that. This is where the screenshots aren't as clear as we wish they would be. But what a student is going to do is they are going to go to FAFSA.gov and they're going to click on Start New Form. Okay. When they do that, They are going to then see this login like they have in the past so that they can log into studentaid.gov. Okay. Now, if a student, for whatever reason, has already gone to studentaid.gov and logged in, they won't see this. And I'm going to show you in a moment what it looks like if they've already logged in. But for this scenario, the student just going directly to FAFSA.gov. It actually is on the student aid website if you look at the URL, but that's a vanity URL. They can go directly to FAFSA.gov and start their FAFSA. They will log in with their username and password. And do keep in mind that their username and password, when they can use their username to log in, they can also use a verified email address or a verified cell phone number. So any of those three things they can use when they're logging in. And of course, then they need to have their password. If they can't remember their username and they can't remember their password, they can retrieve their username and reset their password. And there's a link right here on this particular slide where they can do that. If they don't know anything about the FAFSA and they didn't know they were supposed to create FSA IDs, they can click on create an account and do that from here. We're going to talk about what happens if they haven't created them earlier. We want everyone to create their FSA IDs early, and we'll talk about why that's so important in the perfect world. Now, one of the things I'm finding is that when people are logging in, every time I'm logging in, I'm being asked to confirm my information. So that seems to be standard. I don't know if it's going to happen to everyone every time, but it seems to be the case with me. And I just want people not to worry about that. Doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means they want them to reconfirm that that is currently their identifying information. Okay, so student logs in to studentaid.gov by going to FAFSA.gov. And when they log in, the first thing that they are going to see is they are going to need to go through the two-step verification process. This is one of the changes for this year. Everybody has to go through the two-step verification process every single time they log into the FAFSA. Last year, for example, as a parent, I didn't have to go through two-step verification. So this is something they have rolled out gradually. And now every time anyone uses an FSA ID to log in to anything student aid related, they are going to have to do the two-step verification. They can either verify using their phone number, their email address, or an authenticator app. Here, I've selected the mobile phone as the option. The reason I want to make a big deal about this is that gone are the day as a parent where I can just do this for my kiddo, okay? I can no longer just go in and complete a FAFSA on their behalf, even if I have their username and password. Now, can I find a workaround? Sure. If I've got access to my kid, I let my kiddo know that I'm going to do your FAFSA, you're going to get a text, you've got to send me the text so I can get through this process, then yes, a parent could do it. But federal student aid's intention is that students do their section and parents do their section. So coordination between the student and the parent is much more needed than ever before. So then when the student does complete logging in, they're going to see this screen. Now, keep in mind, an individual can be a student or a parent, so they've still got to select their role for what they're doing at this moment. So, for example, I went ahead and I did a FAFSA as a student because I could be a student, right? So it's the same FSA ID. My FSA ID is tied to me as an individual. It's tied to my social security number. Almost think of it, it's like my signature. So I can either be a parent or a student, okay? So we've seen some confusion on that particular point. But in this scenario, the student has logged in with their FSA ID and they are starting the form as a student. They're going to see 4 onboarding screens. Here's the first one. The first one is what is the FAFSA? There are 3 that follow. One focuses on what contributors are and provides information on that. What to expect is another one, and then what happens after submitting the FAFSA. So I'm not going to show you all of those, but there are 4 onboarding slides that they see only the first time they come into the FAFSA this year. Next, what they're going to do is they're going to verify that their information is correct. This is all pre-filled information. So this information is coming directly from their FSA ID. So when they created their FSA ID, they provided this information. It got verified, hopefully, with federal student aid and with the Social Security Administration, I mean. So this information is pulling over from their FSA ID. If there was an issue with something, they cannot fix it here. These are not fields that can be edited. We had originally understood that these fields would be the address fields, but none of it is editable. So if a student says, oh my goodness, this is wrong, what they need to do is they need to go back to studentaid.gov and go under settings to update any of this information. Now, what I would recommend is that people do be sure that they keep this information updated, um, especially their email and their phone number. Like if we have students that are, they're going to high school, they're going to college, they might have a different email address or they might have a different phone number. It's really important that they keep this information up to date. And again, they do that by going to studentaid.gov and going under settings. They click on that caret beside their name, and that's where they'll see settings. Students will provide their state of legal residence. This is because states in many cases have requirements that students have to have been an eligible resident of that state in order to be considered for maybe a state grant. For example, in Maine, students have to have been a resident of Maine for 1 year in order to be eligible to be considered for the Maine state grant. So they will fill in that information. And then they're going to provide consent. So again, major change to the FAFSA this year, a really good one in the sense that information is coming directly from the IRS now, and it is working so well that people actually think something's wrong, to be honest with you. So gone are the days when people used to use that IRS data retrieval tool where they'd have to enter this information and it wouldn't always match, and they had trouble, retrieving their tax information. That is all gone. But because that's gone, what was actually happening before is I was requesting my tax information. The IRS was sharing it with me, and then I was sharing it back with federal student aid. They've cut out the middle person, right? Which is great, works better, easier. But it also means that I need to consent before they can do that. They can't just take my information and share it with somebody else without my consent. So even though this consent looks kind of long and wordy, it is meant to protect us as the taxpayer. So we have to authorize them to take our information and to use it appropriately when it comes to students applying for federal student aid. So this page provides all that critical information. There's a summary at the top, and then I haven't even included all of the pages. So again, information is going to be transferred directly into the FAFSA. Now, I'm going to mention this a couple times because I don't think we've gotten one comment more than this. Did I do something wrong? I'm not seeing any tax information. That is correct. No one is going to see information that's transferred from the IRS in terms of the income or taxes paid, but it is there. It just is living behind the scenes. Okay, so this page is very long. And this is the bottom of the page, but there's another whole section that I didn't even provide here. So people want to be sure that they understand what they're doing. At the end of the day, they have to do this. If you don't provide consent and click on that approve button, then students are ineligible for federal student aid. Everybody has to provide consent, even non-tax filers, even people who filed foreign tax return. Everybody has to provide consent. So at the bottom of that page, what they're going to see are some FAQs with some additional information, but ultimately the student needs to select approve. If they don't select approve, again, they're not eligible for federal student aid. And as you can see, they can't skip this question. They can decline, they're not going to be eligible, or they can click approve, and then they can continue on. So now what the student is going to see is this new section. It's not a new section, but it's a renamed section called Students' Personal Circumstances. So as I move into this section, what the gist of this section is determining whether or not a student is going to be considered independent or dependent. So these questions that we're going to see in this next section are the questions that if you look and you see what makes a student independent, these are those questions. So like, for example, if you use our Get Ready to File the FAFSA handout, you will see on the back what questions a student can answer yes to. And if they answer yes to any of those questions, they're considered to be independent. So these are those questions. So we start with, what is the student's marital status? Now, in most cases, especially we're talking about high school students, they're probably single. But keep in mind, if a student is married, even if they're young, let's say they're 20 and they get married and they wouldn't be independent otherwise, if they are married, they are considered independent. So that is one of those questions. And of course, we have plenty of students that are much older, and so they might be any variety of marital status. So they're going to provide their marital status here. We're going to assume the student is single. Then they're going to indicate what their year in school is going to be. So again, for most of our first year students, they're going to indicate that they are a first year student. They want to do that even if they have credits from dual enrollment, okay? So this will be their first year getting federal student aid. So we want them to indicate that they are a first year student. They can also indicate that they're a second year student or an older undergrad or junior or senior undergrad or a graduate student. What's behind this are two things. First of all, if a student is a graduate student, they're automatically considered independent and don't need to provide parent information. So that's one piece. The other piece, the first year, second year, or other undergrad, is what a school uses to determine eligibility for a federal student loan. So virtually every student is going to be eligible for a federal student loan, and the amounts are based on their current grade level. So a first year student is eligible typically for $5,500. It's $6,500 if they're a sophomore. It's $7,500 if they're another undergraduate, a junior or a senior. Okay, that's if they're dependent. So that's part of the rationale behind those questions. And then there's a question that asks them if they will have their first bachelor's degree. A student who has a bachelor's degree obviously would check yes to that, but they want to be aware that a student who already has a bachelor's degree is not eligible for a Pell Grant, a Maine State Grant, or many other types of grants. So Pell Grants, Maine State Grants are dedicated to students who are earning their first bachelor's degree. So if someone decides to go back to school, take a different career pathway, that's fine. They can apply for financial aid, but they will not be eligible for a Pell Grant or a Maine State Grant. Okay. But in this scenario, we're going to assume that the student does not yet have a Pell Grant, so they'll be, doesn't have a bachelor's degree, so they're going to be considered for all types of aid. And then here are a bunch of other personal circumstances. So again, these are the things that if a student says yes to any of these, they're going to be considered independent. So basically, if they've been on active duty in the US military for purposes other than training, okay, so they have to have actually been on active duty. If they're a veteran of the armed services, if they have children that they support and provide more than half of this support for their children, or if they have another dependent. We certainly see some students out there who have their brothers and sisters that they take care of. They provide more than half of their support, so they could indicate yes to that. If we have someone who is an orphan, then obviously they would check yes to this question. If someone's been a ward of the court or has been in foster care anytime since they turned 13, they would check yes to this question and they'll be considered independent. And I just want to be clear that, like, let's say in the case of a foster care student, say a student's in foster care at the age of 13 or 14, and then after that, they're reunified with their parents. They would still check yes to that question and they would still be considered independent. I get really nervous trying to anticipate or try to figure out why federal government does certain things, but I think the idea behind this question is that if a student's been in foster care at age of 13 or 14, their situation is probably still a little bit unstable potentially. So I think this is a recognition of that. So anytime since the age of 13, they would check yes to that question. Additionally, if the student is an emancipated minor, they would check yes to this question. Or if the student was in legal guardianship of someone other than their biological or adoptive parents. What we see regularly are situations where grandparents are raising children. So when we see a grandparent at a financial aid night, which almost always someone comes up afterwards and says, hey, this is my scenario. The first question I'm going to ask them when helping them figure out how to fill out the FAFSA is I'm going to say, do you have legal guardianship? And if grandmother says, yes, we have legal guardianship, then I say your student's going to check yes to this question. They're going to be considered independent. None of your information is going to be required on the FAFSA. Okay? So those are some of the other questions that determine dependency. And then there's one more. And this last one is whether or not a student is considered homeless. The student has to be unaccompanied, which means they are not in the care of their parents, and they're either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So for example, they would not check yes if they were in a homeless shelter, but they were with their parents because they are not unaccompanied. So in that scenario, they would say no to that question, and they would still have to provide parent information on the FAFSA. But in any other situations where they are unaccompanied and homeless or at risk of being homeless and are self-supporting, then they would check yes to this question. If they check yes to this question, and we're going to touch on this at the very end, and that can be documented by a certain list of individuals, then they will automatically be considered independent. So we're going to focus more on homeless students at the very end. But for now, let's assume that the student is not homeless. So we're going to continue on with this current scenario. The last case is if a student can't indicate that they are or is unable to say yes to any of those dependency questions, but they still can't provide parent information. So let's say back to that case where the grandmother is who is raising that student, but grandmother never had legal guardianship. But maybe the reason that the student was living with grandmother is because maybe parents are incarcerated. Maybe parents have issues with drug abuse, or maybe there's abuse in the home. And that's the reason the child is no longer living in the home. There are a whole bunch of what we call unusual circumstances that exist for some students, unfortunately. And so they can't say yes to any of the other questions, but they also can't provide parent information. So if that's the situation for that student, they would check yes to that. Again, at the end, we're going to talk about what happens if a student says, yes, I do have unusual circumstances. I know I look like I'm dependent, but I can't provide parent information. So hold tight. We're going to get back to that one at the very end. For the purposes of this one, we're going to say, they say, no, I don't have any unusual circumstances. Then what they're going to see is this slide. Now, after this slide, Jess and Mary, I'm going to take a quick break and see if there are other questions you want me to address, okay? But this slide here basically says that based on the way you answered your questions, you are considered a dependent student and you're going to need to provide information about your parents. Okay, that's great. This is the most horribly worded question I have seen in a long time. So we just want to call attention to this one. Where the big blue arrow is basically asking, does the student want to apply for a direct unsubsidized loan only? And if we read the question, what it actually says is, are the student's parents unwilling to provide their information, but the student doesn't have an unusual circumstance that prevents them from contacting or obtaining their parents' information? So basically, here's how it works. If a student says, you know what, I don't have an unusual circumstance, but my parents just won't provide their information. They think I should just be able to take care of this myself. They, for whatever reason, are just not willing to do this process. One might argue that's an unusual circumstance, but I don't think it's actually unusual, unfortunately. So if a student is in that situation and their parents will not provide information, but they can't answer yes to any of the other questions, they can get a direct unsubsidized loan only. They are not eligible in that circumstance for any Pell, any Maine state grant, or any other types of federal student aid, but they can get a direct unsubsidized loan. I think this was the federal government's way of acknowledging that these scenarios exist. So if a student is in that situation, they would say, yes, I do want to apply for that unsub loan because my parents are unwilling to provide their information. And then the student will work with the school. There's one more form that they have to fill out, and they can be considered for that unsubsidized loan. The vast majority of the students that we're working with, though, need to answer no to this question because they do not want to apply for an unsubsidized loan only. They want to apply for all types of financial aid, and their parents are willing to provide information on the FAFSA. So the vast majority of students should be saying no to this question, okay? Don't like double negatives, and that's what this one is. Okay, before we move on, any questions that you two have had come up that you want me to address with the whole group?
So again, we still have some coming through about assets, specifically small business, that we'll hold on to.
Mhm.
We're not forgetting about you. And the other questions are about undocumented parents or parents who are not US citizens. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to hold it? Is there another section?
No, we can do it now. So how it's supposed to work is those parents are supposed to be able to create a federal student aid account. So keep in mind that the student does have to be eligible. And I am going to show you where the student is going to indicate that. The student has to be a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen in order to qualify for federal student aid. However, the parent doesn't have to be, and they never have had to be. So parents can be undocumented and students can still get federal student aid. So as we continue through, I'm glad you said it now, Jess. I'm going to show you when a parent can create an FSA ID who doesn't have a social, and when they go to fill out the parent section, how they're going to go about that. But yes, they would fill out the FAFSA, they would provide their information, just like someone who does have a social security number. So their process is going to be very similar with a few little tweaks to it. Okay, but I'll cover that more.
The two questions around that have to do with a parent who has a social security number just for work purposes. But maybe in the past didn't have one, so his 2022 taxes didn't have that. What should they do there? And then what if the parent lives in a completely other country, so they're not even sure those soft credit check type questions are going to work?
Yeah. So we have posed the question about what happens when a parent has a social security number only for work purposes. And what we're being told is those parents should go ahead, try to create an FSA ID. And when they create their FSA ID, enter that social security number that they have that's only for work purposes. We're being told they should be able to get through the process doing that. Parents that live out of the country, the reality is, if there are unusual circumstances, and there are some cases where, a student whose parent doesn't live in the US, maybe that is going to be the case. But let's just say it's a case where we do need the parent to fill out the form. They have to fill out the form. If the criteria is such that there's not a reason to not have the parent fill it out, they need to do this. They need to get an FSA ID and they need to go through this same process. Of course, it's online, it's available, outside of the country as well for people to access this form. So they would still have to go ahead and do that. Okay.
And then so they would go through the process of just going through the verification via ID, the paper version of creating it.
Yes, and in that webinar that we did in November, we talk more about that. So basically, if people can't answer the knowledge-based questions, which again, I think there's an issue with them even being presented, then they do have to provide documentation. They have to provide documentation that is valid. They have to sign an attestation form. I'm not saying that correctly. That what they're saying is correct. And then they have to provide like either a license or a passport or something else that's currently valid. So that webinar goes into the details. If people don't pass the identification, the knowledge-based questions, and confirm their identity that way, then there's a list in that webinar of what, and you can just look at the slide deck of what documentation is required.
Excellent. Okay. And then just one other clarifying question is, so if a person has a new social security number, parent, but in the past they have filed taxes with a different code, an ITIN, which is probably what you would file with before you had a social security number. I imagine it's going to create a challenge with the matching on the IRS side of things.
Yeah, what I would anticipate, and I don't know this for sure, but what I would anticipate is, first of all, that person wants to create an FSA ID using that new social security number. I do think when they're doing the FAFSA, and they're not alone, there's going to be some scenarios, I'm going to talk about a few of them in a moment, where parents' information from the IRS either isn't going to come over identity theft, or it's going to be a case where things just don't match. So it's not available. And so there are going to be times when people are going to have to manually enter their information, their income information. And I'm thinking justice might be one of them. But we haven't seen it yet, but I think that could likely be the case. Okay?
Yeah, that does it for now.
All righty. So let's continue on. So we are, again, just to recap, we're in a situation where we have the student starting the FAFSA and they are a dependent student. So we are still in the student section. So we have identified the fact that parent information is necessary. So now the student is going to provide information about their parents. I'm not going to go through all of the various scenarios of marital status and all of that. For now, let's just assume that the student's parents are married. So if I indicate that the student's parents are married, that it basically says then both parents' information is going to need to be provided. Now, there's something called a parent wizard, and we saw this parent wizard, but apparently it's not working. So I was going to show you some of the parent wizard, but knowing that it's not working, I'm not going to share it with you. I expect it's something they will get fixed, but it's supposed to guide students through the scenario. So kind of like we did when we were identifying contributors. Are the parents married? You know, do they file a joint tax return? Are parents divorced? If so, who provides the most support? That parent married now. So it's supposed to work them through that. So again, doesn't appear to be working now, but you might see it going forward. And if you do, it's supposed to make this a little bit easier for students to make sure they provide the right parents' information. So we've identified that the parents are married. And so this is where the student is going to invite their parent to fill out their section of the FAFSA. This is that critical form I mentioned at the beginning. The invite is what ties the student section together with the parent section. So this is a really, really, really important screen. Now, I can see here, and you can see here, that there's room to fill out two parents. But I also want to highlight that here it says, we highly recommend you only complete the parent who will fill out this form box. I don't know why, you can provide either then, okay? So we really want you to just provide the one. So I was working with my sister. She's Ellie Anderson's mother, for any of you that know my sister and Ellie. And so I just had her put in just her information here. Even though she's married, files a joint tax return, for now, I'm only putting in her information. She has an FSA ID. She's the parent that's going to log into the FAFSA. Now, it's absolutely critical that this information match. So her date of birth, her social security number, her name, I call her Becky, she's legally Rebecca, all of that has to be exactly what's on her social security card, because what's on her social security card is what she had to use to create her FSA ID. All of this stuff needs to be in sync, okay? So this information absolutely has to be correct. If it's not correct, this process is not going to work. So the email address, though, does not need to be the same email address that exists in the FSA ID. So like, for example, my FSA ID is under my Gmail account. My kids know that if they want to reach me via email, they're going to send it to my main email address, right? So they've made it flexible enough that the student can use whatever email address is most likely to get to their parents. It does not have to be the one that was used when they created their FSA ID. But name, date of birth, and social security number absolutely have to match. So back to what Jess asked a moment ago. If the parent doesn't have a social security number, this is new this year, they would check this box. If they check that box, they are going to be asked to provide mailing address. So for people who don't have a social security number, mailing address is a critical piece of information, because that's going to be one of the pieces that they're going to use to do that identity match. Now, I don't have answers to questions like what happens if they've moved recently. I don't have the answers to that yet. I hope to learn them over time. But what I do know is if a parent doesn't have a social, they would click that box and they would then provide their mailing address. So you can see where my sister's information was filled in. I didn't fill it in. She didn't fill it in for her husband, and everything was fine, and we could click continue. And I do recommend doing that. The FAFSA that we did went through very, very well. We had no issues with it. And I think why they've done it, I don't know if they'll change this year. I think it's because it's creating confusion when both parents fill out this, because then they both get an invitation, but only one has to log into the FAFSA if they have a joint return. So I think that's what's behind all of this. But at the end of the day, just provide the one parent. If information for the other parent is required, for example, they filed separate taxes, then there will be an opportunity later for the first parent to add the other second parent, okay? So for here, just the one. So now the student is going to continue on and answer some demographic information about themselves. Again, we're still in the student section. What they're going to answer are things like, what is their gender? So these are the 4 choices. A couple of key things that I want you to know. They do not, the answers to these questions do not impact eligibility at all. They can click, they prefer not to answer these questions. And that's fine. Again, no impact on eligibility, and information is not being shared with the school or others, like with us, right? Which is kind of a bummer. We find it very helpful when we get this information. We've known for a long time that our male students don't file the FAFSA at the same rate as female students. That's helpful to us. But for this year, no one's going to get that information, only federal student aid. So they can answer that question however they choose, certainly can feel free to skip it. Same thing with race and ethnicity. You're going to notice a lot more questions here that were never existing in the past. So students can certainly answer those questions. They can skip those questions by saying they prefer not to answer. Either way, no impact on eligibility and not being shared with the colleges or anybody else. The student is going to be asked about their citizenship status. So if a student is a US citizen or national, then they're going to indicate that, and they will move on to the next question. If the student is an eligible non-citizen, then they will have another field open up where they will have to provide their A number, their alien registration number, okay, that's on their green card. If you are ever unsure about whether a student is considered an eligible non-citizen or not, I just want to mention that if you go to our website, in the new Mainers section, under paying for college, we have this cool tool that someone fabulous at Fame built that basically allows people to go through the questions. If you don't know what your status is, they can walk through those questions and it will tell them at the end, you are eligible or you are not an eligible non-citizen. So check that out if you have a student that's in that situation, okay? So students can indicate either US citizen or eligible non-citizen. If they are neither, they're not eligible for federal student aid. So hopefully they can answer yes to one of those. Then they're going to provide information about their parents' educational status. This question has been on the FAFSA for years. They've made it a little bit easier to answer. So basically, has one or both parents completed college, for example, if that's the case. So just answer that however is appropriate. Again, this does not impact eligibility for anything federal student aid related, and we don't have any programs in Maine where this would impact eligibility. My understanding of why this question is asked is that there are some states that have eligibility for certain programs based on a student being a first generation student, first in their family to go to college, and they use this question. Here in Maine, it doesn't impact any of the aid for the state or for the federal government. And then there's this question about parent being killed in the line of duty. So there are some criteria where if a student lost their parent was on active duty, and after 9/11, their parent was killed in the line of duty, or if their parent was a public safety officer, which includes, law enforcement, firefighters, emergency service workers. If students have a parent that was killed in the line of duty, they would indicate yes to this question. By indicating yes to this question, the student is automatically, with documentation, considered eligible for a full Pell Grant. Now, a full Pell Grant right now is $7,395, so that's a nice amount of money. Their other aid, all of the other aid that the school is going to give them or any other federal student aid is going to still be determined based on their student aid index, that number that's replaced the EFC or the expected family contribution, okay? So they'll get a full Pell Grant, but their other aid will be calculated based on their student aid index, okay? So be sure that students in that situation check yes to that. And then they're going to list their high school completion status, whether it be that they're going to have a high school diploma, a GED, they're homeschooled, or none of these. If they indicate that they have a high school diploma, it's going to ask them for information about their high school. They'll start by entering their state, but then they'll answer their city. They'll see a drop down and hopefully see their high school. If not, they can manually enter it. In this case, we were able to find the high school and select it, and then confirm it. If the student is homeschooled or if they have a GED, they will not see the high school questions. Only students who indicate that they have a high school diploma will see these high school questions. And then there's going to be a question about the students or section on the students' finances, okay? Here's all that students see when they were tax filers and their information transferred from the IRS. These are the only two questions that a tax filer will see. There is no question anymore on the FAFSA where they ask for anyone's earnings. Okay, so earnings from the W-2 are no longer a question on the FAFSA, not even for non-tax filers. So no one is answering earnings questions on the FAFSA. That's gone. That's FAFSA simplification took that one away. Okay. The student, if they did not have their FSA ID authenticated, and this is why we want students to have their FSA ID authenticated, matched, why we want them to get it at least 2 or 3 days ahead of filing the FAFSA, is because they would then have to enter all of their income information manually. And at the very end, I'm going to show you a screenshot of what that information consists of. But for everyone who says yes to the consent question, and for everyone who has an FSA ID that's been authenticated, these are at most the only 2 questions that they are going to see related to their income. Now, I think where the issue is coming from is that there's nothing here that says your information has been transferred from the IRS. So this is why people are thinking they've made a mistake, because nothing's telling them that they're okay and it's been transferred. But we just need to trust that it actually is being transferred. We're seeing that, and that the only 2 questions they need to answer are here. I do want to just highlight this question about the amount of college grants, scholarships, or AmeriCorps benefits reported as income to the IRS. When a student is in college, so think about returning students. When a student is in college, they have maybe hopefully gotten financial aid from the prior year. Maybe in 2022 would be the case here. If they received grants and scholarships that exceeded their tuition, fees, and room and board, then they were supposed to report that as income to the IRS. Because they reported it to income on the IRS, we don't want that to count against them. That's why they would list it here. Now, the reality is that the vast majority of students do not receive enough grants and scholarships that it exceeds the amount of their tuition, fees, and books and supplies. So this is going to be a 0, again, for the vast majority of students. That said, if you've got a student who has a ton of scholarships and grants or goes to a very low-cost school, they might have reported some of their income, on their tax return, they might have reported some of those grants as income, okay? But for most people, this is going to be a 0. Again, just want to restate, they're never going to see any federal tax information that was shared with the direct data exchange. That's what they're calling that transfer of information from the IRS directly into the FAFSA. They're never going to see it in the FAFSA, and they're never going to see it in the FAFSA submission summary. That's the new SAR, the new student aid report. Okay, now let's just say a student created their FSA ID and immediately went to start their FAFSA. They're going to see this here. This is where it's going to say, we recommend that you start the FAFSA later when your FSA ID has been fully matched, because otherwise you're going to have to manually enter a bunch of information. So I'll show you what that information is at the very end. So we want people to get their FSA IDs, wait 2 or 3 days until they've been matched, authenticated, and then go ahead and file their FAFSA. Same with parents. Last but not least in this section is where students would provide their asset information. They would list the total amount of cash checking savings, and the question I got today via email, but they would not include federal student aid. So let's just say they were one of those students who got a lot of federal student aid. They have some of it still sitting in their bank account. They can exclude that amount, but they would list any other amount in their checking and savings. They would list any current net worth of investments, including real estate or their business. Jess, I'm going to hold tight and take questions about small business stuff when we get to the parent section, even though I know the questions are the same.
We're good.
Okay, so students would finish that section off, and then what they're going to do is they are going to select their colleges, and I will take a break after this section and address any questions. So they're going to select their colleges. Basically, what they're going to do is they're either going to search for them by the school name, by providing the state and city, or if you know the school code, you can put that in. That's going to be even easier. Now they can list up to 20 schools on their FAFSA. One of the things we're saying when students are coming to our events is we want to be sure that people go ahead and have a list of schools ready. because the FAFSA is not being processed right now, so they cannot go in and make a correction right now. So we want to be sure that they're listing every school that's a possibility on their FAFSA when they're doing it now, because otherwise they can't add new schools for Betsville. So once they've selected their school, it will be showing here. They can remove it if they made a mistake and picked the wrong one. They can continue to search for more schools and select those. So they can do as many as they want, up to 20. Going to note that the housing plans question has been removed. That question is no longer asked on the FAFSA. So colleges are having to figure out how they're getting that information. Then the student is going to see this page. And so it's going to say, okay, take a moment before you sign. Here are all of the sections. They've all been completed except for the signature. They can expand on all of them and see all of them. They can click on here and look at the individual sections. If they see something that doesn't look right, they can click on the question hyperlink, and it can take them back to that section where they can update that question or do whatever they need to do. Because the student invited the parent, they are going to see that the parent has been invited, but at this point, the parent has done nothing. So it's one of these cases where the student can see what the status is with their parent. If they're ready to continue, they do continue on. They get to see all of this, legal stuff. Down here, they're going to click that they want to sign their FAFSA. They will click this box and they will click on sign. So at this point in this scenario, the student is simply signing the FAFSA. They are not submitting it because the FAFSA shouldn't be submitted until the parent section is complete. So that's why they are only seeing the issue of the opportunity to sign. And I'm going to stop here. And then I will continue on with the parent section.
So not a lot of new questions. The one that came up that that I think you might address a little bit later is about when FAFSAs will be processed and when the portal might be available for school counselors and partners, but I'll let you maybe address that when we get there.
You bet. Okay, sure will. Okay, so this is what a student sees when they submit their FAFSA, or excuse me, when they sign their FAFSA. I misspoke there. When they sign their FAFSA and their parent has not yet done their section, they have simply signed the FAFSA. It tells them, that your section is complete, but you do have your contributor that still needs to complete their section. So they see that. This is the bottom part of that same screen, the bottom half of the submission screen. There is information here that talks about that FAFSA submission summary. So this is one of the places, we will talk about it at the very end as well, but this is one of the places where students get informed as of the timing. So basically it's saying that once your application is complete and submitted, you can check the status of your form beginning in late January. So basically the FAFSAs are being submitted, but they're being held. They're not being processed yet. They won't be processed until late January. So until the FAFSAs are actually processed in late January, there is there's no status update for people to see, and there is no way that people can make a correction. Additionally, the schools are not receiving that information until late January. So this is the indication for the students, if they read through this whole page, to kind of see, it's basically a hurry up and wait situation right now. Now, there's one thing I want to note. I'm not recommending this, but I want to note that down here, do you see where it says provide parent information manually? We have certainly students I'm sure that you are working with who are in a situation where their parents are very disengaged for a whole variety of reasons. So there may be situations where students want to go in and fill out their parents' information. Their parent will still have to log in because the parent still has to provide consent and approval and sign the FAFSA. But a student could do that, but I don't recommend it because they're going to have to enter all of the income information manually. So I really think the better scenario is for us to figure out how to get the parent to go in and provide consent and approval. My perfect world scenario for this situation, which is I think how they designed it, which doesn't exist much of the time, is that if we have a student and a parent and they can sit at the same table together and they both have their own device. The student starts the FAFSA, they do their piece. Once that we got beyond that invitation page is when the parent could then do their section. So a student can be working on their section and a parent can be working on their section, and whoever finishes it last will be able to submit it. That's the perfect scenario, but I recognize that does not exist for a lot of people. But if we can create that scenario as often as possible, I think that's going to make this the easiest process possible. Okay. So now what I want to show you is the email that the contributor gets. So the email is going to go to the contributor because, again, the student in the invite section provided an email address. So whatever email address they used, this is where this invitation is going to go. Now, there's two ways a parent can get into their parent section. They can click on log in the email, but of course, our IT is always telling us don't click on links, especially unknown ones. So parents might not be comfortable doing that. Totally get that. So instead, and I actually kind of recommend this way, they just go ahead once they know the invite's been sent, they just go to studentaid.gov and they log in with their parent FSA ID. I think that's the best approach. Now, if a parent doesn't do that quickly, they will get a reminder at 7 days and at 14 days. If a student does their section of the FAFSA and a parent doesn't do anything after 45 days, that FAFSA is going to be deleted completely. So we've got to make sure that within 45 days, the parent goes in and takes action so that that FAFSA can get submitted. So this is what it looks like. So again, I just had my sister log in and she can see that she's Rebecca. So you can see that on her dashboard, it says pending invitations. You have one or more invitations. Go to my activity to view invitations. So she clicked here and then she saw this form. So this says basically, you know, your daughter wants your help with the FAFSA. So she can go ahead and she can click on accept invitation. When she does that, she sees this here. Again, she's already logged into studentaid.gov. So she simply sees that, yes, she is going to be sharing her information and she would click on continue. If it's her first time into the FAFSA, she's going to see those 4 same onboarding screens that we talked about earlier. This is going to look really familiar, okay? The parent section looks very similar to the student section in many ways. So you're going to think I'm kind of repeating myself. I am. But in this section, it's the parent that's completing it. So the parent is going to review all of their information. They're going to make sure that it looks correct, just like we talked about in the student section. If it's not correct, they cannot update it here. They're going to have to go to studentaid.gov and go under settings and then update that information there. Parent is also going to have to provide consent. So parent will provide consent. It's the same consent. This just tells them what they need to do. It's going to tell them that this information is going to be transferred directly from the IRS into their FAFSA. They too will see the frequently asked questions if they want to check that out more, but ultimately the parent needs to click on approval for the student to be considered for federal student aid. They are going to ask some demographic questions about the parents. They are going to ask for the parent's marital status. Now, the student did provide some information about the parent, but here is where the parent is going to indicate what their current marital status is. So remember, marital status is as of the day the FAFSA is filed. So we know that parents who are recently married don't like this because they might have only gotten married 2 weeks ago. But on the FAFSA, they need to indicate that they're married, which means that both the parent and their current spouse's information are going to be used when determining financial aid eligibility. The parent is also going to provide their state of residence. And then we're going to get to the parent financial section. Now, let me talk about federally means tested benefits. Okay, so there are a variety of federally means tested benefits, and if individuals can check yes to any of these questions, any one of these questions, then what that means is they are going to be exempt from having to provide any asset information on the FAFSA. So you're going to note here that it says at any time in 22 or 23, did any family member receive any of these means tested benefits? So if people can click yes, they want to click yes, and then they won't be asked any asset information. If student did provide asset information in their section, that will be ignored. Now, hopefully all of you have heard, because goodness, we've put it out in lots of different ways, that we had been provided guidance by federal student aid in writing on October 4th that Maine is a state that everyone is receiving free and reduced lunch. So we were given the guidance that everyone who's a public school student or has any kids in public schools should answer yes to the free and reduced lunch question. Then, and NCAN and all of the other organizations, were getting the same guidance. There's a very funny woman on TikTok from the California Student Aid Commission that shares her experience because she also had provided the same guidance based on direct confirmation with federal student aid. About 10 o'clock Friday night, on January 5th, they released the student aid handbook, which had different guidance and said that you could only answer that question yes if you were eligible based on income. So they basically changed the policy. They revised the policy. So people should only be checking yes to that question if they indeed were eligible based on income. We do have the guidelines handy if anyone is interested in what they are. They're publicly available. So first of all, let me apologize. We thought we were relying on the best guidance, and it was the guidance we had, and we wanted to be sure that our families took advantage of that. That was going to be a good thing for them. If families have filed the FAFSA already and answered yes to that question, when corrections can be made, they will be able to go in and change the answer to that question. People might be exempt for other reasons. Certainly, if they can answer yes to any of the other questions, have them do that. If they earn less than $60,000, depending on the schedules that they file with their taxes, they will likely be eligible from providing assets as well. So there are other ways in which they can be exempt. If they do have to provide asset information, we want them to keep in mind that there are assets that are excluded, like their primary residence and their retirement. We'll talk about assets again in just a moment. But we realize this is not the way we wanted things to go down. We're really sorry that we couldn't trust the guidance from federal student aid. I've worked in student aid for 31 years. I've never seen them reverse guidance like this, not in the middle of a cycle. We'll move on, but that is where things stand today. Parents will indicate whether or not they did or will file a 22 joint tax return with their current spouse. This question is necessary because, again, we go back to, did they file, joint or separate, filed married joint or filed taxes separately? Now, here's another question that we've been calling attention to. So this family size question. So for dependent students, this exists in the parent section. For independent students, they will see this question. And basically, but what it says is the parent's family size different than the number of individuals claimed on their 22 tax return? So it should be correct if there's not been a change, but what we're seeing, it is not correct. So it defaults to no, but we want everyone to check the answer to this question. So what it's doing is, in this case, it's pulled over 3, and this is despite the fact that there might have been a younger sibling. So the number of children or other dependents who live with the parents and receive more than half of their support from the parents and will between July of 24 and June of 25, they are going to need to be manually entered into this block, okay? So again, if you've got a household size of 4, currently it says it's 3 because it's pulling off the tax return, married joint return, and they always include the student. Here you're going to list any other siblings. So you're not going to list the student. They've already been accounted for. You're going to list any other siblings or anyone else that the family provides more than half support for. Once you enter a number here, let's say you put a 1 in here, this will update to 4. Okay? And so we want to be sure that everybody checks that and make sure that's correct. The larger the family, theoretically, the more eligible for aid a student is. So an important question to check. They are going to provide an answer to the number of people in college. And you'll notice it's people now because it used to just be students. And it used to be that the EFC, and now it's called the SAI, was divided by the number of people and the number of students in college. That is no longer the case. So the SAI is not being divided by the number of people in college. But the question is still on the form. And if families are in a situation where a family member, be it parents or other siblings, other children, are attending school and they're paying out of pocket, they want to reach out to the schools and let them know that. They want to let them know that trying to pay for 2 kids in college, if it is a financial burden, that they are struggling with that. If their student is going to a school where they're not having to pay out of pocket, then there's no sense in following up. But they can follow up as what we call a special circumstances situation if indeed they have more than one in college and it is creating a financial hardship for that family. So parents, again, are only going to see these two questions. Everything transferred from the IRS, assuming that they filed taxes. Manual pathway will appear if the tax filing status doesn't reflect the current marital status. So let's just say that a mom answers the question that she is divorced, but in 2022, her tax return was a married joint return. They've got that tax information behind the scenes. And they can see that those are inconsistent. She will then have to manually enter her income information because only her information is going to impact student aid eligibility because she is divorced. So only her information is going to be required. Unless, of course, she's gotten remarried since. But let's just say mom just got divorced last year. She's not married currently. 22 was a joint tax return. She will automatically see the fields to enter in manual income information, and she will only include her portion that was listed on the 22 tax return. Lastly, we're going to talk about assets. Now, one of the interesting things that you will note is there's no untaxed income section. Yay. I mean, that's so much easier. It means that families, for example, that were contributing to retirement plans, pre-tax, none of that is being asked for. None of that is impacting financial aid eligibility. But there was one question that used to be in the untaxed income question section that they wanted to maintain, and that was annual child support received. Because there's no other place to put it, it's in the asset section. People who don't have to provide asset information also do not have to answer this question, okay? So if people do have to answer assets and they do receive child support, they would list that here. So they're going to list any, I see Jess's cat, they're going to list any child support that they receive. Now, the amount of child support that they list is a little bit different. So it's for the last completed calendar year. So when they're filling out the FAFSA, yes, it's using 2022 income from their taxes, but the child support received should be for 2023, okay? So they're going to list their assets, cash, savings, and checking. They're going to list the net worth of their investments, including real estate. If people have a 529 plan, that is where that is going to go in this investment category. Couple of things about 529s. They're only going to include the value of the 529 for the student whose application they're completing. It's no longer that parents have to provide the total value of all the 529 funds in their account. It's only for the portion that is in that student's account. And the 529s are always counted as a parent asset for dependent students. So even though the student is the beneficiary, it is listed as a parent asset. That is the case even if we have a student out there who at 18 opened up their own 529 account, which they could do. It still should be listed as a parent asset, always listed as a parent asset when the parents are filling out the FAFSA because the student is dependent. And then there's the question about net worth of businesses and investment farms. So the primary residence is still excluded. The value of retirement plans still excluded. What is not excluded this year is the value of a business or a family farm. So previously, if a business had fewer than 100 full-time employees, a family-owned business, it was exempt from the asset section. It is no longer now. So I know Jess is going to ask me a question. I'm probably not going to be able to answer it. But when it comes to determining the value of a business, it's a little bit tricky. It is the net worth of a business. We are still waiting for guidance from federal student aid. They say they have it coming. The way I think about it is, if a family has a business and they were trying to insure that business, what would be the value that they would insure it for? But let me emphasize that it's the net worth of the business. So it's the value minus any debt against it. Okay, so the net worth, not the value. And with a family farm, the family farm does have to be listed as an asset as well. But if someone has a family farm and they live on the property, they want to exclude their primary residence. So they take the value of the farm and they would subtract from that the value that is their primary residence. And they would also subtract like the garage, if their garage was next to their home and their garage was where they parked their cars, and not being used for the farming. So they're going to list the value of the family farm, but they're going to exclude any piece of that that's considered their primary residence. So I will stop there and see what questions you have, Jess.
I think you did a really good job at answering the way the questions were asked. I think the big one people are wondering is, why did this happen?
I know, I know. Well, I don't know. I really, really don't know. And there was a lot of backlash about this. And we actually in March saw some information that it might be changed. It didn't happen, but I would definitely keep my eyes and ears open for next year. This is a big deal here in Maine. I'm not saying that it's not. I think the small business is probably a bigger issue than the family farm, although I know we have family farmers that are being affected by this. You can imagine out in the Midwest what ire exists about this question. So I think we need to hold tight. It's on there for this year. But next year, I don't know if it will be on there. So let's see where it goes. Write your congressperson, reach out to your senators and House reps and let them know that you want this changed.
Yeah. And the idea, so we at FAIN don't have any specific guidance on how to, assess at this point. We're hoping it might come, but for now it's take
Yeah.
the value,
Do your best. Do your best is all that we can say. And, just like you, we've been really searching for that guidance. And we also attend training. So we attend all of these trainings so that we're ready to do these ones for all of you. And every training that we go to, this gets asked and it's the same response. We haven't gotten guidance yet. Okay. All right. So based on that, I'm going to move on. And so in the scenario where parents are married, we talked about the importance of the student only providing information for one parent. So that happened. But information about the other parent is required and always has been required. So this is where information for the other parent would be required. So the parent, like my sister, just filled in her husband's information. Again, we knew that they were a married joint couple, so that he doesn't need to have an FSA ID. He doesn't need to sign into the FAFSA. I will tell you that I actually left off the email address just because I think the email going out is confusing to people. So I just left it off and I was able to do that because he does not need to take any additional action. If someone, filed separate, then that is going to be revealed in the FAFSA. So the screens will be updated to say that the other parent does need to provide consent and approval. I don't have a screenshot of that, but that is the way that the process would work. Now, we are seeing some glitches with this page. I think we have now identified 6 scenarios where the parent is filling out the FAFSA. They've got an FSA ID. They get to this screen. They're providing their spouse's information. It's saying that it doesn't match. In some cases, the person doesn't even have an FSA ID. In other cases, they do have an FSA ID, but they can't get into it. We're doing all of our troubleshooting. It's telling us on one hand that the account doesn't exist. But then on another hand, when we go to create a new one, it's saying that an account does already exist. So we have definitely reported this up. I've also had this go through fine. So we cannot figure out why it's going through fine sometimes and why other people are having issues. If you do have people who cannot get past this page, we'd appreciate you letting us know. Just send us an email with the student and parent's name and dates of birth, if you would, please. So then the parent will see this. See how quick the parent section was? I mean, the parent section is so easy, you guys. So they would have the ability to review their questions, but notice that they cannot see the student questions. They can only see theirs. They would then see the summary screen and they would click on the box and you're going to see here it says sign and submit because the student has already signed their section. So now this is the last section to be completed so they can sign and submit. When the FAFSA is submitted by the parent, they are going to see this congratulations page. They're going to see some additional information, but I want you to note what they don't see is they don't see the SAI. So parents are not receiving information about whether a student is eligible for a Pell Grant or what their SAI is. only the student is getting an email with the SAI information, okay? Only going to the student. This is the email that a student would get. So this basically says that we've gotten your FAFSA. The email is coming from the U.S. Department of Education with the subject line, "We received your FAFSA form." It tells them when they submitted it, and it gives them their student aid index. We know that a lot of scholarship organizations want to know what the students that they filed, first of all, and what their SAI is. And this is where students are receiving it, is in their email after their FAFSA has been submitted. So very briefly, I want to run through kind of how it works when a dependent student has a parent start the FAFSA. I'm not doing all the screenshots because you've seen them and they are very much the same. So if a parent starts the FAFSA, what's going to happen is they will provide the student information, just like the student provided the parent. They're going to provide that's the invite. So the student name, social, date of birth, and email address. They'll see the onboarding screens. And then they will see the questions regarding dependency status, those personal circumstance, the homeless question, the unusual circumstance question. So in this scenario, parents will answer those questions. And the reason they have to answer them is because if any of these are a yes, there is no parent section to complete. So the parent has to answer those questions first to determine dependency status. Assuming the student is dependent, they're going to see this. Again, careful on the wording of this form. This should be a no if parents are filling out the FAFSA. Next, parents will see the following sections, the same ones we just reviewed in the parent section. They'll review their parent identity. They'll provide consent and approval. They will provide demographic information. They will deal with their parent financials, the parent info section if applicable, and then they will review and sign. Now, keep in mind, under this scenario, the student section is not yet complete. There's some questions answered. The student will have gotten an email, or the student can log directly into studentaid.gov. When they do that, they're going to see this. So you can see Jess did what for her student. So Jess started the FAFSA. She answered the personal circumstances questions. All the answers were no. So her daughter's dependent, but her student got the invite. Her student logs in and she sees this. So she says, "I'm going to accept that invitation." And then the student can go fill out the rest of their form. But I do want to take a quick hiatus here and just say, if we have some of those parents, I'm not recommending this necessarily, but if we have parents who just want to do it all themselves, they cannot do it all themselves. But with this link here, just like we saw for the student, the parent could go in and answer the rest of the demographic questions about the student: race, gender, list their colleges, and do all of that. Now, they'd have to provide tax information manually, though, okay? But a parent could do that if they chose to. But regardless, either the student's going to go in and finish off their section, or the parent's going to go in and finish off the student section. Again, they're going to complete the demographic information, the financial information, but a parent does it, it's going to be all manual, and list the colleges. At some point, the student has to log in with their FSA ID because the student has to provide consent and approval and sign the FAFSA. Otherwise, they're ineligible for federal student aid. So even if mom does all of the other stuff, student still has to log in and do that. Or, the student can log in and they can take care of all of their demographic, student financial, and sign. Okay? Either way. Now, once a FAFSA is submitted, once both sections are complete, the last person submits it, here's what they're going to see if they go to federal student aid. They are going to see under the My Activity, they're going to see in review. And these FAFSAs are going to stay in the in review status until FAFSAs are processed, which is going to be late January. So the fact that these are all showing as in review is the way that they're supposed to. That means that the FAFSA has been submitted and it's being held until federal student aid is ready to start processing FAFSAs. So in the last couple minutes, I just want to share a few more scenarios. I understand some of you may need to leave, but independent students will see all the questions that the dependent students see, but they will also have to answer that family size and number in college questions. If they're married, they will need to invite their spouse if their spouse did not file a joint tax return with them in 2022, okay? If their spouse they and their spouse did file a joint tax return in 2022, then they will just need to list their spouse's demographic information, but their spouse will not need to sign in with an FSA ID. Again, FSA IDs contingent on tax filing status. I talked about in the beginning, earlier on today, about unusual circumstances. So sometimes students are going to have unusual circumstances. So if students are in a situation where they cannot provide parent information because of it's an abusive household, they can't find their parents are incarcerated or something like that, they would check yes to this question. And then they would see this. They would see that they are a provisionally independent student, which means their FAFSA can be submitted, an SAI will be calculated, but pay attention to this. I know you all probably all know this. They have got to follow up with the school. So they've got to follow up with the colleges that they want to attend or are attending, and make sure that they provide the documentation about their circumstances. So they won't be able to actually get financial aid until this process happens. And just briefly, I want to say about the homeless student. We talked about the situation if a homeless, an individual student indicates that no, they're not homeless or unaccompanied, that's fine. And it is the case for many students. But we do have an increasing number of students who are homeless. So if a student checks yes to the homeless scenario, then they're going to see this. And basically, this is going to ask them, did any of the following determine that the student was homeless during the period of July of 23 on, okay? So if a student, for example, is in high school and their high school homeless liaison can document that, then they'd say yes to this right here. Or any of these other people. So basically, if a student's in a TRIO program and the director of the TRIO program or their designee can document that they know that the student is homeless, they could click yes to that. If they click yes to that, the student is considered independent. Again, the school may require documentation, but the student is considered independent, just like if they'd answer yes to the legal guardianship question. If they say no, that yes, I'm homeless, but no one can document it, then what they would look at, if they say no, is that they're going to be considered provisionally independent, just like those unusual circumstances. So in this scenario where no one can document it, the student is going to have to work with the student is going to have to work with the financial aid office to discuss their situation. Okay. And so they will do that, provide whatever documentation they can. The financial aid person will document the conversation, and they will make that determination that they can be considered independent. Now I'm distracted because I just noticed one thing here. They're saying they won't calculate your SAI. That's contradictory to what we were told ahead of time. So I'm just seeing that now because they had told us that the SAI would be calculated, but apparently not until the student has worked with the school and the school has documented their situation. And then last but not least, these are the additional questions that exist when someone has to complete the manual pathway. So these are the questions that get asked. These are the things that are coming over automatically from the tax return. But when the tax return isn't coming over, either because of identity theft, foreign tax return is filed, they didn't provide consent, or the FSA ID has not yet been authenticated, all of those are marital status and tax filing status or a mismatch. Under any of these circumstances, they are going to see all of these questions. And so they would have to answer those. And here it says, you can click on this link to see where those questions can be found. So if you click on this, it will show you where on the tax return they can find the answer to each of these questions. So federal student aid announced on November 15th, that no ICERs, that's what we call a FAFSA record, they get sent to a school, will be sent until the end of January. That's because they're not being processed until the end of January. Students can't make any corrections until the FAFSAs are processed. Again, end of January is still what is being said. Schools will start making corrections once they've got the files loaded and know what corrections, if any, need to be made. Students will be notified of their SAI and Pell Grant eligibility. That will be in the email that goes to the student. But just keep in mind that that FAFSA submission summary is not going to be available until February is what we're hearing. If a scholarship organization wants a copy of the FAFSA submission summary, they obviously can't get it right now. Many organizations are willing to accept that email that had the SAI in it. They'll use that in the meantime. So students who are applying for scholarships like Worthington can do that, or others should check with their scholarship provider to make sure what their next steps are. We will be holding FAFSA help sessions, virtual and in person, starting tonight, and they will run through February 15th. We'll add more if needed. You can find a list of events on our events page. We also have fabulous staff at FAME. You can call, you can email, and get your questions answered that way as well. And then we do have the FAFSA simplification resources that lists a whole bunch of work that we've been doing or stuff that we've been sharing throughout the last 9 months. Lots of presentations. This one will go there as well. There are tools like the prototype, lookup tables for Pell Grants, and some other things. So we'd love to have you check those out and see the information there and share that as is appropriate with your families. All right, I'm a little over time, but I'm going to stay until everyone feels like we're done. But I do recognize that some of you may need to leave because I am over by a little bit. Jess, are there questions that?
Yeah, so just to go back to when our portal will be available.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, our portal. Well, just like the schools, FAME will not get FAFSA data until the end of January. So FAFSA data should come to us at the end of January, and then we will load it and test it and make sure everything looks good. Now, like I said, there have been 3 test records so far. I don't know if I said that actually today. I said that to someone today. Hopefully testing goes smoothly for everybody. So what I would say, we already have the list of seniors from the Department of Education. So I'm saying the second week in February. What I would love to be able to do, assuming that they're on the schedule, that they get it to us at the end of January, that right around the time of February break, we would have that available. If there's a delay in federal student aid sending out FAFSAs, that's going to push the time frame for us to have the portal ready back a bit. Okay.
And then another question was had to do with the new opportunity for folks that are homeless or at risk of homelessness, having the TRIO director be the person who can write a statement for them. It says the TRIO director or their designee. Can a TRIO director have more than one designee?
I believe so.
Excellent.
I believe so.
Could be the whole college. I'm just kidding.
Anything else, Jess?
I think that's all the ones, and we'll give people just another minute, folks, if you want to put some questions in, but I think we touched upon, I think, a lot of the big ones. You did such a good job.
Thank you, Jess, for being there. I did open up the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording here. So just bear with me for a second while I stop recording. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.